Hello, my name is Leslie, and I am the host of the Why Not Today podcast. This is a podcast to celebrate people who have been courageous and said, Why not today? I started this podcast in honor of my father, Patrick Kane, who often did say, Why not today? I'm based in Reston, Virginia, a planned community right outside of Washington, D.C., and thanks for joining us today. So I've got a guest today that I really don't know very well. I met her quickly shopping one day, and it's kind of funny how I always talk about connections and how you meet people, and it was destined to be. So if you listened at all, you know I spend a lot of time at Smith Mountain Lake, and our guest, the guest I had 2 weeks ago, Jay Bond, I was in her. She has a cute little store at the lake, and I'd gone in one like on Friday, and she wasn't there. And then Sunday it was kind of a dreary. It'd been raining, and I was like, oh, I'm kind of bored, so I just went by. It was like 4:45. She closed at 5, and I just thought I'd go in to say hi. Well, I walked in the door, and she immediately says, Leslie, you got to meet my friend Jessie. And she wrote the book, which I do have. We're going to talk about friendship, suitors for a journey. And I had my hand on the book the first day I was there, but didn't buy it. But Jessie and I stood there and talked for a long time and got to know her. I'm like, oh, you have to be on this podcast. So I'm super excited to have you here today, Jessie. So I'm going to have you introduce yourself with a fun fact, and then we'll get into the courage stuff and your stories. So thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I think Leslie J-Bond stayed open probably a half hour later than she wanted to because we were all in there shopping and talking.
I don't think I left till 6 o'clock.
Oh, you left after me. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a great little store. And we are sporting, not today, but we are sporting her sweatshirts to just share about who she is and her online store and all that. So I'm so grateful that, I met her. I was the speaker at Eastlake Community Church last year, and she had a table there for like a vendor table, and we met at that conference. And then my daughter and I went right to her store. As soon as the conference was over, we went right to her little store, and it's been fun to watch it grow into 3 locations now since last summer.
Yeah, it's fun how those connections, like, I shared my last episode of how we met, which is a crazy connection. And it's just me being at the lake is another crazy connection.
I know how God opens those doors. It's so great.
Tell us about you, Jessie, and a fun fact.
Well, my name's Jessie Seneca, and I live in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And we also are at the lake at Smith Mountain Lake a lot. And that's how I met Leslie. I have a ministry in the Northeast, but it takes me across the whole country and into Canada. So it's been fun to go throughout the country and meet women and speak at events and conferences. I'm also a Lifeway U-Lead trainer with that organization. And so that's been a real blessing as well. And so I had that ministry, started it in 2000, where are we? 2010.
Okay.
And so it's been a great journey. I am married to my high school sweetheart. That's kind of a fun fact. And we have 2 daughters, grown, married. We have 4 grandchildren, 3 boys and 1 little girl, Parker, who's just 9 months. So I keep telling J-Bond that she has to get some girly little baby clothes in that store.
That would definitely go over well.
Wouldn't it? I tell her that all the time.
Yeah. Sure.
So I'm balancing being a Mimi and family and ministry and in a new season of ministry for that. But I love, all that God has allowed me to do and be, and really probably Leslie, like you, just trying to balance some of that. The fun fact is I ride on the back of a Harley of my husband while he's driving it, and I can sightsee. So that's fun.
Okay. Would not have expected that. That's really cool. So let's start with, what does courage mean to you?
Well, I've been thinking about that, and there's so many things that I've been processing through that. But basically, I think just having the confidence to fearfully move forward. And I say that because I'm a Christian speaker, and I look at that faith chapter in Hebrews chapter 11, and I look at a lot of those people and think, yes, God called them to do something, but you cannot tell me Noah wasn't a little fearful. Like, those people in there didn't have a little bit of fear, but they just followed what God had called them to do. And so when we know what our calling is and where God is taking us, we can have a confidence that's not of our own, right? But we're able to step out into that calling, even afraid,
Yeah,
that we don't know what tomorrow looks like, but we know who holds tomorrow.
absolutely. And you got confidence and courage. Nobody goes into that without a little bit of fear.
Yes.
And they
Yeah,
may
and your
say
knees
they do,
shaking.
but we all do. So you've got an interesting journey, and I loved your book, and what attracted me to the book was friendship, which is, I think, so important to me, and building those relationships. And I think I've shared on this podcast before, there was a study done that talks about, it's a study that's gone on for, I think, since the 20s or something. It's years, and they've studied people and happiness and a good life, and they said the only common thing they could find that led to a happy, healthy, long life was deep relationships and friendships.
Mhm.
And that's so important. And I think, so you have this devotional that you wrote about friendship, and I love it. It's a bike, and you can kind of explain the analogy to that. But I think when we talk to friendship in the book, it's important, but how you got there.
Mhm.
And you definitely had a courageous journey, a health journey. And I'd love for you to talk about that and how that transformed you and the path and journey your life has taken because of that.
Oh, yeah. I'd love to share a little bit about that journey. I was 27 years old when I came down with a disease called Cushing's syndrome. And it's when you have too much cortisol in your body. And my girls were very small, 2.5 years old and 6 months when the onset of the disease happened. We didn't know really what was happening initially because we didn't have the internet and couldn't check Google and,
Yeah,
all of that.
may have been good.
Yeah, yeah. So we were just relying and trusting on doctors, and it was quite the journey to get to where we found out what was wrong with me. And so, at the onset of the disease, I ended up in the hospital for 5 months when my girls were very young. And at the beginning of December, all the way through till Easter, with being home about 3 days in between that time.
Wow.
I was in 4 different hospitals. Two of those were psychiatric facilities, where the longest visit was 2.5 months in a psychiatric facility because they didn't really know what was wrong with me. They kept treating the emotional state, but they weren't treating the disease because they didn't know enough about the disease. And so it's a very bizarre, it's a rare disease, although I don't think it needs to be as rare as it is. And that's for another podcast. But
Yeah.
I was in the psychiatric facility and my symptoms just continued to worsen with hair growth on my face, moon face, acne all over my body, sugar diabetes, a large hump on the back of my back, thickness in my stomach, and just the will to live
Wow.
was not there. But this particular hospital that I was in, that psychiatric hospital, it was a secular hospital with a Christian section to it. And so there were Christian counselors and psychiatrists, and the nurses were wonderful. But there was a particular counselor that believed my husband that there was something physically happening to me to be causing the emotional state. And so she would pray over me almost every day that she was there. She would come in, she would pray over me, and she would say, Jessie, one day God's going to use all of this. And really, all I could say, Leslie, was, can't you see I'm dying? And she's like, I see what's happening, but I believe God has a plan. And all I could say was, Jesus, I love you. I couldn't read my Bible. I couldn't think beyond that. And just, kept going and surviving until one day my husband found out about a doctor at the University of Virginia. And that became my hospital for 20 plus years of
And
going
you're
back
still in Pennsylvania?
from Pennsylvania. 5-hour drive. Sometimes it was once a month. Sometimes it was, every 3 months. And then there were times where I just stayed in a hotel and was there. But they saved my life multiple times. So Cushing's is a disease, like I said, that has cortisol, too much cortisol in your body. Most people have it on their pituitary, a tumor that's producing that too much ACTH, which then becomes cortisol in your body. Well, I happen to have a tumor on my left lung that was producing this hormone. And so once they found out that there was a tumor on my lung, they removed a portion of my lung. And I did well for a few years, but then another tumor appeared, and that happened 3 different times with a full left lung removal. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, so that was kind of crazy. The initial onset was a pituitary brain surgery, which it never was there. And then that's what caused me to be in the psychiatric hospital because they didn't know what was wrong with me, and they needed like a holding place till they figured that out. And then about 14 years ago, I had another tumor in my chest cavity that they removed. And I have been free of the disease for about 14 years, but I still continue to check myself. I still continue to, test yearly and that kind of thing, just to monitor all of it. And so the interesting thing is, Leslie, when I was in that psychiatric facility, this counselor prayed over me. Like, Jessie, one day God's going to use all of this and you are going to be sharing and giving hope to other women. And it was hard for me to believe at the time, and I had no idea what to expect. But a few years after the onset of it, I was sitting in the audience of a Women of Faith conference. Do you remember those conferences?
I don't
Did
think
you
I
ever
ever
hear
went to
them?
one.
They
Well,
were a pretty big conference throughout the country for, I don't know, 10 to 15 years. But the very first one was in 1996, and it was in a church in my hometown in Bethlehem in Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania. And I remember sitting there in the audience, not realizing or understanding what a calling meant or, what God's plan was. But I felt what that counselor spoke over me was going to happen when I was at this conference, and just some things that were said. And I didn't really share it with anyone except for my mother-in-law that came with me, because I didn't know what that looked like. But I knew God had a plan. And so I'll be honest, it was hard. And this is kind of what I also want to share with women and those that listen to your podcast. It's in the wait that we find God and we find ourselves. And so it took 12 and a half years for God to open the door to what I thought he had called me to in that audience, on that chair. And I questioned it for many years. God, is this really what you want? And I want to say it wasn't like I didn't do anything in those 12 and a half years. I could go through my resume of the volunteering that I did, of the things that I started, Bible studies. I was over children's ministry for 12 years, and just different things that I did throughout those 12 and a half years. But when I look back on all of it, God used every single position, every single um, action that I did, everything. He used all of it to bring me to where I was when I walked into my full-time ministry in 2010. And so you can look back over your life and see God's hand upon it. And I know, Leslie, that's what gave me the courage to finally say, this is the year that I am going to step into full-time ministry. Both my daughters had left for college, and I started to write my first Bible study. And so I just trusted him, right? Because really what he's asking from us is obedience.
yes.
And we have to be obedient, but we have to leave the outcome up to him. And I'm sure you've seen that even with starting your podcast.
Oh, absolutely. Without a doubt. Yeah. I mean, just starting this was like, I don't know what it looks like, and I have no idea, but I'm like, all right, I picked a date and I
Yeah.
started. And I've been obedient to an episode every 2 weeks. And since it started, so that's over a year and a couple months. So, but yeah, and I totally can relate to what you're saying. I think this podcast and what it's done really aligns with what you're talking about. That I think what it's doing is giving women and people hope to do the things and have courage to say yes.
Yeah.
And I know that it is a calling and it's bigger than me. And there's ways that we can help change lives,
Mm-hmm.
influence lives by giving people just courage to do the things and say the things and move forward and fight. Like you had to fight with your illness. I mean, that's crazy.
Well, and I know you're reading my friendship book, and in that book I talk about the importance of that tribe, right, of friends
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
help. And
There was one story you shared, and I'd love for you to share it here, is about the friend that came to you not knowing. She's like, she quit her job or something and came just to help you.
well, actually, she came to my husband because I was in the hospital. And at that point, it was a few weeks in, a month in, and no one knew what was going on, how long. I mean, we never fathomed 5 months of being in the hospital.
And were
But
you
she,
sharing what
pardon
was
me?
going on? Were you sharing with friends and family, what obviously family, what was going on, or
Well,
was
my
because you're in a
husband was.
psychiatric, well, because you're in a psychiatric
Yeah.
hospital, and
Yeah, I
those
was
days,
not.
did you talk about it, or did
Right,
anybody
I
talk
was not.
about it?
And we didn't have social media, we didn't have cell
Right.
phones, texting. So it was basically family and our church, that knew because you have the prayer request and,
Right.
that type of thing. So that was pretty much how that was, you know, dispersed. And our neighborhood. So our neighborhood would do meals every 2 weeks. Our church would do meals every 2 weeks. So they went back and, did that for almost 5 months of me being ill. And I should say probably 6 months. And, the month after I came home from the hospital. But yeah, this one friend, her name was Sarah, and she would watch our girls when they were, when we just had the one, she would say, go out to dinner and I'll watch the girls and, that type of thing. And so I was friends with her, but not like best buds, good,
Right.
but she felt like God was saying to her that she should help with our girls. And so she came to my husband and she said, I'd like to help with your girls. I know you don't want to put them in daycare and I really want to help. And she was a stay-at-home mom, Leslie, but she was one of those stay-at-home moms that, I don't know if you ever heard of Bible Study Fellowship, but that's
Her husband.
2-day commitment. She was a leader in that. She had 2 sons that were in 3rd and 1st grade. She was homeroom moms, for both of those classes. Her husband was a very affluent chef at a country club in the Lehigh Valley. And you know what that means, nights and weekends.
Yeah.
And so she did everything around the house, everything, cutting grass, you name it. She did it. And so she really stopped everything except for her wifely and motherly duties
Right.
and took care of our girls 4 days a week while my husband went to work.
Wow.
And it was just the most precious thing, not only for our family, but for so many who were watching what was going on. And I'm just getting ready to publish my 10th book. And you will always find a small portion of that story in every book. So not only did the people who watched it happen, but now who are reading like you,
Yeah.
and seeing the impact that one woman can have. And the great thing is, I mean, my girls are still, here we are 30 years later from the onset of that disease. They are still close to her. She
Oh, I'm
visits
sure.
them. 6 months before our first daughter got married 7 years ago, she came to me and she said, Mom, would it be okay for big Sarah and George to walk down the aisle, after the grandparents? And I was like,
Wow.
absolutely. And so you can see, I mean, I think today they call these bonus moms,
Yeah.
that just impact your kids' lives and how important it is to have that.
Yeah. I've got a good friend of mine, and her kids call me their fake aunt.
Oh, that's so
A little
fun.
fake niece and nephew. Yeah. And I often wear, and I have it on today, a starfish necklace. And I think you have. Did you have one on? No, it was somebody else.
Not a starfish. No.
So do you know the story of the starfish?
Remind me of it. I know I read it at one time.
So this guy was, and I probably talk about it on the podcast a lot because it's one of my favorite, is this guy was walking down the beach and picking up starfish and throwing them in the water and picking up starfish and throwing in the water. And somebody walked up and said, what are you doing? There's millions here. You can't possibly make a difference. And he picked one up and threw it in the water. He said, I made a difference in that one. And so I really live by that motto that you just never know whose lives you're going to touch and what the little act of kindness is going to make a difference. And now with social media, who's watching you?
Right.
And just somebody watching you and you giving them hope, or somebody listening to the podcast or reading your book or going to your ministry, you just never know who that one person, that event you went to how many years ago that you had that calling sitting there. It may be nobody else was affected that whole event, but you, and I've got a good friend in ministry and we talk about that a lot. When you were doing things in ministry and speaking to people and helping, it's like, if we can make a difference in just one person's life. So
Leslie, that is so true. I remember early on, before I had a ministry, and I was just, doing volunteer ministry type things. And I remember the church having a mother-daughter banquet and thinking to myself, well, man, I've got this great story. Why don't they ask me to share?
Mhm.
Right? That was kind of like my thought process. And I
Right.
remember waiting for my daughter. She was 4 years old at preschool. And I was listening to a song on the radio. I can't remember what song it was, but it really spoke to me. And I felt like through the song, God was saying to me, Jessie, would you be willing to speak to one person? Because I honestly was at this Women of Faith conference. I didn't know what to expect, what it was going to look like. I kind of just had myself on the stage, of Women of Faith, and like really, that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But I thought it was going to be like to multitudes of people. Now God has opened that door years later, right? But initially, would I be willing to speak to one person? And I was so humbled, and I was like, absolutely. And honestly, within 2 weeks, we had a fairly new pastor, and he came to me and he said, Jessie, would you mentor this other woman? Now I'm only 29, 30 years old. I'm like, mentor, but she was a little younger than me. And I said, yes. And I knew, Leslie, from that point, that God had my plan, like he had the path for me, and I had to trust in him. And, even a few months ago, I did a retreat and there were only 32 women there. And the women were like, we're sorry, there's only 32 women. I'm like, it does not matter to me if
Exactly.
one or 1,000, I am still going to minister the same way. I'm still going to share. I'm going to still encourage it. And honestly, if one person comes up to me from a conference and tells me their life has been impacted and changed, I feel like, God, I've done what you've called me to do.
Exactly. Yeah, I have a mentor in Mary Kay that taught me, when you're doing an event, and of course we want lots of people to come, and that's probably about us, not about
Right.
them. And she said, if you turned it around and you came to an event and you were the only one there as the guest, you had one-on-one time with the speaker, how blessed would you feel? Like, oh my gosh, that would be amazing. So
Yeah.
you think about that. And the worst
The
thing you can do
opposite.
is
Yeah,
say
that's true.
from a stage going, oh, I'm sorry there's not more people here, or too bad more people didn't come, because it makes the people that came feel bad for coming. Like, if they didn't come, why did I need to come? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just, and it's those, and talking about just obedience, it's doing those things that, like, I didn't know why I was going to start this podcast. It was kind of about me when I started. Like, oh, this might be fun. Who knows? But it's become about so much more. And the people I've met, it's just crazy, the path and the connections. Just walking into J Bond's store, meeting J Bond,
Right.
walking into her store, you being there at that exact time when she was closing. Like, we both of us really shouldn't have been there, and so many
And
other
we
people.
knew it was a God moment when we started
Oh, yeah.
talking.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. And, so many other people that God has led me to in this path of this. And it's just kind of fun to see where
Yeah,
it's
that's
going.
great. So
And
fun.
yeah, I'm looking forward to doing more things with you and hearing more about what you do. So, anything else you want to share about your courageous journey, or things that happened
Well,
in this
Leslie,
process?
a lot of times when I'm speaking or at events, women will ask, how do you do what you're doing? How do I get to do what you're doing? Kind of thing. And I wish I could give them a formula, and I know that there are others that have this grand plan and they've got it all planned out, a 5-year, plan, 10-year plan. I never really had that. I was just obedient with what was right in front of me. And I think going through the things that I went through and still continue to go through, and considering what could be, right? I always looked at each day as such a gift from God. I really did. And, my husband and I both try to live in the present. And that's hard sometimes, right? Because we're always wishing for something, right? Wishing for this, wishing for that. I'm wishing that my 4-year-old grandson would be potty trained, like all those kind of things,
Yeah.
right? But I just followed God each day, and he opened doors that I never expected. And I always felt like it was, if you're faithful in the small things, he will take care of the bigger things. And like you said earlier, it's bigger than you. There were so many things. I had a She Leads retreat, or She Leads conference for 12 years, 2 of them a year. That turned out like bigger than I ever expected. We're doing a She Leads retreat at the end of December in the Lehigh Valley. And we started a mom's conference called the Real Mom Conference. And it's just been like one step at a time. And even the books that I've written, they were nothing that I ever set out to do. I never set out to be an author. I really did not. And there's even days I'm like, I'm not an author, because I read them and I'm like, who wrote this? Like, I know it's God's hand upon me, writing it. And so it's just being faithful with what's in front of you and letting God take care of the tomorrow,
Right.
And I'm not saying you don't plan, because I am a planner. I know maybe it doesn't sound like a thing. And I plan. I absolutely plan. There was one time I was on a walk, and God gives me a lot of creative things on a walk. I was on a walk.
Me too.
I had this whole event planned out. Who was coming? Who was speaking? Up for an hour. I had this whole plan, right? And I'm like, okay, I'm going to call so-and-so when I get home. And by the time I walked into my garage and unhooked my dogs, I felt like God was saying, I never gave you that. We're not doing that. But I knew there was something bigger than what I could do. And eventually, within 6 months, God showed me what that was. But it was just being obedient. And I could have totally stepped out and said, I'm going to do this conference. But once I felt that no from God, I had to be obedient to that.
Yeah, isn't that funny? We make all these perfect plans, and then God like kind of laughs at us, like, that's not where we're going. Yeah, and I think that's where I've been with this. Why Not Today is just being open to, like, it's going here, and then it goes here, and then it goes there, and then it's like the people and the connections, and I'm just like totally led. There was one episode I had, and it's probably one of my top episodes. I was up in July of last year. I was in upstate New York with a good friend of mine, and the person I was supposed to interview for the podcast got COVID. And so we had to reschedule. So my friend and I are going for a walk, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I haven't missed one yet. She goes, interview me. I'm like, okay, what have you done courageous? She's like, got clean from being addicted to Oxy. And I didn't realize her whole journey. She had several surgeries, and I knew she was in a bad place here and there, but I didn't realize how bad she was. And that afternoon we did her recording, and her family and people didn't even know the extent of her recovery and her addiction. And it was just like such a God thing that, it was that perfect moment that she's like, yeah, me. And I'm like, really? So you just never know. And I'm just kind of being obedient. So how would you encourage somebody else to be courageous?
Wow. Well, I think a lot of people have a dream, or it's something that's been placed on their heart, hasn't come to fruition yet. And I just want to encourage them. The wait is a big part of birthing that, right? Yeah. We think about even having a baby, that 9 months before, the anticipation of the birth, right? The just preparing you. And so for me, as I prepared in the wait, because it wasn't just like, okay, I'm going to sit still and rest all day and eat bonbons, that I was going to actively wait,
right,
for God to move. And so I think just being obedient in that, in what he's given you for today, as I've mentioned that before, and just being actively waiting, I think is important. And for me, it was, like if God would have opened the door when I thought he should, it would have been a hot mess, a train wreck. I needed to study God's word, and I've got a long ways to go. But for those 12 and a half years, I just delved into God's word, studied it, Bible study after Bible study after Bible study, to get, to know the word of God before I went out and started teaching it to others. Right. And so I look back and I'm like, okay, God, yeah, you were right. But I actively waited in that time for when he was ready to open the door. And once he was ready to open the door, and this is what I tell people, you will know when that time is. I have no doubt that you will know absolutely when to step forward, because for somehow, some reason, it just all connects and you're able to walk through that door. And so that's what happened with me. And I think, just to encourage people, even though if something hasn't come to fruition yet, just to trust God with the outcome.
Well, that was for me. Thank you. I needed to walk in that store that day to hear you share that one thing in the wait, because there's a lot I want to do with this and I'm impatient, but I'm like, at this point, it's not an income producing activity. So I need to work on the one that does, and
yes,
patient and know. And so thank you for that. The other coincidence thing that I forgot to even mention is, so your book with the bike, a good friend of mine that has a ministry in North Carolina uses a bike as their kind of one of their logos and a lot of bike stuff. But your forward from your book is by Gwen Smith, who spoke at one of her conferences.
Oh.
So it just goes full circle.
I love Gwen. She's amazing.
Yeah, she was awesome. So I will share in the show notes how to connect with you, but how can people find you? What's the best way?
Yeah. So I have a website, moreofhimministries.org. That's the name of my ministry, based off of John 3:30, that he would increase and I would decrease. So More of Him Ministries. And then you can find me on Facebook. I have my regular Jessie Seneca page, and then I have a More of Him ministry page as well. And then on Instagram, just look up Jessie Seneca and you can find me there too.
Okay.
And LinkedIn, but I'm mainly on Facebook and Instagram.
Yeah, you and me both. So, all right, we'll share that. So thank you for sharing your story. I'm so glad I bumped into you that day. Thank you for everybody for listening and watching. And you can find everything Why Not Today under Why Not Today podcast, under Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, website, all those things. On the website too, we do have Why Not Today swag. It's a great graduation gift. Why Not Today? We have cups. I have t-shirts. I have vinyls. Thinking about maybe journals. So if anybody would be interested in a journal that said Why Not Today, let me know. So again, thank you for listening. Make sure you share, like, comment, and thank you, Jessie, for joining us. And I'm excited to get to know you better. We'll have to meet for a coffee at the lake sometime.
Oh yeah, that would be awesome. I would love that. Thank you.
We're probably closer to each other between where I live in Pennsylvania and the lake, but. So thanks again, and thanks everybody.
You're welcome.